Welcome to the London Luminaries, 15 heritage properties working together to celebrate our collective history. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm the host for this evening. I get the joy of welcoming our wonderful chair this evening, Professor Judith Hawley.
Hello everybody, welcome to this London Luminaries lecture. This is another of us in our series of talks on the theme of love and death. We've had some great talks already and we have some more planned for you. So do check our new website for details of the rest of the series and of recordings of the previous talks. My name is Judith Hawley and I'll be chairing this talk. And I want to say thank you to those of you who are watching and also really want to thank those who work behind the scenes to make these events possible. And it's great that we have so many speakers as well who are put up by our 15 contributing properties. It's been a joy to work with everybody. So let me introduce tonight's speaker. James Wisdom has been closely involved with the study of local history in West London since the 1970s. He chairs the Brentford and Chiswick Local History Society. He also helped to set up the Friends of Gunnersbury Park and Museum and has been studying the history of Gunnersbury Estate since the 1980s. He is joint author of Gunnersbury Park, The Place and the People, which was published in 2018, and James will give you information at the end about how you can buy this wonderful little book. Over to you, James.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Judith. Let's start with the 25th of October, 1690. There was a magnificent funeral procession following the body of Sir John Maynard from his Palladian mansion, Gunnersbury House, to the Church of St Mary's in Ealing. He had been one of the three Lords Commissioners for the custody of the Great Seal of England, effectively the Lord Chancellor. He was a lawyer who had reached the peak of his profession, but he'd been practicing from before the Civil War right up to having a part to play in drafting the Bill of Rights under William III. In this talk, I'll outline his legal career, his legal work and his religious beliefs because they matter. Then I will tell you about his family and his marriages and the estate he created at Gunnersbury. But the main part of the talk will be showing how his widow organised the whole process of mourning, the lying in state and the heraldic funeral. And we may finish with a few words about the growth of undertaking in the late 17th century and a little more about his widow. This picture here is a picture at Blickling, a National Trust property in Norfolk, which descended through his last wife. If you look very carefully at the top left-hand corner, you can see the base of a portico. And that suggests that this was actually painted at Gunnersbury House itself, where there was a huge portico. I think he is dressed in his judge's best summer robes, and he may be leaning against the bogus pillar because he suffered from gout. It may be a picture made a year before he died. He was from Devon. He spent half his life in Devon and half his life in London. He was politically nimble. He was excluded from Parliament twice, once during the Protectorate and once again during James II's Catholic supremacy. He came from a legal family and he was also an MP. He practiced in Westminster Hall from 1628. And at the end of this image, you can see the four courts: King's Bench, Common Pleas, Chancery and Exchequer. And this was basically Maynard's workplace. He seems to me to have been proud of just being a barrister. He was a barrister pretty well all of his life. He reminds me of Rumpole of the Bailey, who refused to be appointed a circuit judge. He called them circus judges. But in Devon, Maynard was a recorder in two courts for over 40 years, so he was a judge. His early work involved prosecuting Strafford and later Lord. He was one of the prosecuting team, and there's a little box of them all down at the front of the picture, and I guess one of those is John Maynard. Both Strafford and Lord were working to assert the divine right of the king over parliamentary or religious power. The impeachment was for high treason. Both of them failed as impeachments, but they passed a law executing them anyway. So it was that was his early working career. Let's move on to the politics and religion. He was elected MP 10 times between 1640 and 1648, when he was purged from the Commons by the Protectorate. He resumed in 1656, and he nearly got through complete to 1690, but he kept a low profile when James II came to the throne. He was mainly MP for Plymouth, for Totnes, and for Bere Alston. And Bere Alston is quite important and will come back to us later in the talk. He was a Presbyterian. That's a Reformed church. It's led by councils of elders, not bishops. His primary interest was the governance of the Church of England. He wanted to reform that. So he was part of the Westminster Assembly in 1643, which led to the reform of the Church of England and also to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the Directory of Public Worship, which he had a hand in, replaced the Book of Common Prayer. When it came to Charles I, he accepted that he was king, but he was annoyed by what actions he took. This is a beautiful 1665 primary school in Bere Alston, which is between the Tamar and the Tavy, and it's got a fabulous door, and it was built with his money. It's his primary school. He was involved in a lot of education in Devon. Let's move on to the legal career. The King's Bench was the senior criminal court. It was developing common law. Maynard could act for prosecution and defence. He took briefs from the Crown and he took briefs from Cromwell. So he was, as I say, he was nimble. Cromwell appointed him Sergeant at Law and then Protector's Sergeant. He was one of the people who campaigned for the Restoration. He was then accepted by Charles and made King's Sergeant, and he was knighted in 1660. The important thing about this is that he had to conform to the Church of England to be made a knight. His specialisms were habeas corpus and writs of mandamus. Habeas corpus we know quite well today. Mandamus is basically we command, that the court commands. And he was effectively controlling lower courts. And his main work was protecting the citizen against the misuse of power. He spent a lot of time collecting and annotating old cases. He had a fantastic library of legal authorities, a massive collection, and towards the end of his life, he tried to put it in some sort of order. Okay. Now, he married many times. He married Elizabeth Henley in 1630 in Devon. She's a Devon woman, and this was his sort of primary marriage. They had 7 children. Elizabeth died in 1655, and importantly was buried in Ealing, not in Devon. So it suggests that he had made a sort of permanent transition to Ealing at some time before 1655, but we can't find evidence. We know he was wealthy. He had bought the manor of Bere Alston. It had been a medieval silver mine, and lots of people bought it because they thought there was still silver in it. What it actually did was produce lead, tin, and arsenic. It gave him a relatively safe seat in the House of Commons. And then in 1657, he married Jane Selhurst. And together, they began building this Palladian mansion at Gunnersbury. So it's almost like a new life with a second wife. For him, for her, he was his second, she was a second husband. And I think they pooled their cash to buy the estate and to build the house. Now, this is a fantastic late 18th century picture of the sort of fecundity and beauty of the Gunnersbury estate. There are 4 or 5 in the series that Payne painted. It's possible that they are actually advertising for selling the estate. So just think how bad nowadays the estate agents are compared to the way they sold them in the 1790s. And if we look at the next picture, you'll see the enlargement of Gunnersbury House. It was red brick. There was this stone portico, which I've mentioned already. The window surrounds were in stone. The roof was green Westmoreland slate, and we stumbled upon a piece of that in one of the flower beds 3 or 4 years ago. You could see this clearly from Richmond, and if you stood on its equivalent of its roof today, which I have done, you can see the O2 Arena. So it looks over the whole of the valley of the Thames towards London. It's a fantastic sight. And there we have the house on a map. It's Roke's map, 1740s. I'm sure you recognize it. And you can see that we've colored the terracing. So the house is at the top of the terrace. Then there's a formal parterres. Then there are 2 canals. And then there's a gate and a path or a roadway leading to paddocks. And you can see the terracing in the picture above, but it's been amended by its new owner, who was very fond of Italian architecture. The thing that I can't make out is the enormous orchard under the word Gunnersbury. It's Roke's symbol for an orchard. It's absolutely gigantic. And the only thing I can think is that because he came from Devon, he enjoyed making cider, but there's no evidence of any cider making in his will. So if anybody can explain why the largest field in the whole area is full of apple trees, I'd be very grateful. The wonky path, by the way, is still part of the Gunnersbury Park. If we look at the next picture, we see the north front. It's rather a severe building. There's a carriage arriving, and stables and offices were built down either side in the 18th century. So this is the front door, but the main side of the house was the garden front. Okay, now we have to get into his marriages because they matter. So Jane Selhurst, the rich widow, died in 1668. So she'd been married for about 11 years. She'd occupied the mansion for about 6 years, and she was buried in St. Mary's in Ealing. By 1671, we know Maynard had married Margaret Prugine. Now, she'd already lost 2 husbands, and she was the daughter of a lord. And that means that her family was an armigerous family. And there's a sketch at the College of Arms showing his arms, which are the 3 hands, and her arms, which are on the right of your shield. And they are annotated with letters for the suitable colours. And that was designed by the college in 1679. But by 1680, Maynard had married again, the widow of Sir Charles Vermeuden. Now, Sir Charles was the son of Cornelius, who you know was the man who drained the fens. If you look very closely, you can see that the clerk of All Hallows, London Wall, didn't hear what she said. She obviously had a Dutch voice, and he's written Bermuden rather than Vermeuden. So there she is in 1680, And it's Mary who is the widow, who is the wife, who has to marry Maynard in 1690. So the next picture is of the Ealing parish register, 25th of October, when Lord Maynard was buried. Okay, so that's the background of Maynard, a Devon man working in the law, working in Parliament, member of Parliament, engaged in political activity, massively concerned with the future of the church, and goodness knows how long it took to get from Devon to London and back again. Probably about as long as it takes on a train today. So he must have been exhausted, being as busy as he was as a lawyer. And now we turn to the almanac. This almanac is 1/3 of a passport. It is only 3 inches tall. It's an almanac for 1690, and it's the steward's notebook. So it's in this notebook that the steward recorded all the disbursements for the funeral. So if we look at an enlargement at the top of this page, October 25th, 1690, prepared for the funeral, capital F, those 2 Fs are actually capital F, of the body of Sir John Maynard. And then, as you are doing with invoices and receipts, 4, a mantle, a helmet, coat and crest, sword, target, gauntlets and wreath. So here is the steward recording the first expenditure. He had a heraldic funeral. His funeral is registered in the College of Arms, but there's more to be said about that, which I'll save up. He was dangerously ill, apparently on the 23rd of September. He died on the 8th of October. The funeral was on the 25th of October. So the family had presumably had about a month to prepare for this activity. So now we move to the lying in state. I apologize to you now because these are transcriptions from the steward's notebook. It's not the most exciting way of presenting a notebook, but it does tell us some fantastic information. What we have on this page is the application of a massive amount of fabric, black broad baize, it actually was, over the great hall, the pillars, the double staircase, the rails, the long room, the dining room hung dark, passages hung dark, the stateroom and the portico hung with baize, and the cost of workmanship. And look, the damage by cutting the mourning. In other words, this material was hired. Okay, now we can put that on the ground plan of the Gunnersbury ground floor. At the top of the picture, you see the entrance facing the north. That's the rather severe brick entrance. So that's the main house entrance from the road. That then comes down into the great hall with the pillars, which are swathed, and then the huge staircase to the right of that, which takes you up to the large building. And you can see also that there's a large room under the portico. So we'll go up to the next floor, where you will see that the stateroom has been hung in deep mourning, and they hired 3 dozen silver sconces, a rail of state with new velvet, 4 mourning stands on each side of the corpse, 10 large silver candlesticks. You know what a lying in state looks like because we saw one only a few years ago, and there are candles on each corner. And also hire of 10 large plumes of feathers and 6 days, that's the lying in state days, the 6 days, and a new 6-breadth velvet pall for 5 days. That's huge. Okay, so now let's go to the upper floor and see it all. That massive great space in the middle is the stateroom. It's absolutely stunning, great space. The portico is south of that, and just where the cursor was before it came through the door to the portico is just to the left is my guess, for that's where Maynard was painted. It's possible that the very large room in the middle on the left-hand side is a dining room, because its staircase leads straight down to the kitchens in the basement. You have to imagine the whole interior swathed in black baize. It's astonishing. Now we go to the coffin. And they paid £22 for a double coffin. What that means is that it was probably a coffin of elm wood, but lined with lead, or possibly that the lead was wrapped around his body in an anthropomorphic form. But it was definitely a double coffin, would have been lead inside wood, covered with velvet, both coats of arms on one shield, because Mary Vermeuden came from a family called Upton, and they were already armigerous. So she had her arms on the coffin. The coffin was lined. We can't read the next bit, but it's a bed of sweets, which will be perfumed flowers. The body was preserved, and the burial dress for £2 may have been in linen, and that she would have paid the fine of £5 because of the status. And now we look at the heraldry, a mantle of black velvet with gilt knobs and tassels, a helmet of steel. So there's silk, there's velvet, there's silver, and there's gold. Gauntlets of steel. Maynard never wore gauntlets of steel. Maynard probably never carried a sword, not like Devon is today. And the target is their word for the shield. Now, we don't have a picture of this, so I've had to cobble up a bogus picture which shows you the sort of thing we're talking about. These would be symbols laid on or around the coffin: the crest, the helmet, the mantle, the coat, the sword, the badge. The helmet is a photograph from Carinian Museum, but it's identical to one of the three that the College of Arms used to hire out, so that people who had never worn a helmet in their working lives could have it as part of their funeral. Now we'll look at his coat of arms. The coat of arms is 3 red hands cut at the wrists, or as the heraldry people say, 3 sinister hands cooped at the wrist, ghoul. And on the left, you've got Maynard's bookplate, which is the Judgment of Solomon. So it's a lawyer's bookplate. Okay, I'm sorry that the coloured picture is so grisly. It's stained glass in the Middle Temple, and not easy to photograph. Now we'll turn to mourning. Now, mourning was a business, and the steward was paying out. There were 6 days lying in state, and so they hired 20 mourners in mourning suits and cloaks at 7 shillings a day to be in the building 6 days. They had hat bands, they had pairs of gloves, and they had use of cloaks. And then on the day, they hired 52 mourners to stand before the hearse, which was quite a pricey cost. They will also have hired a porter with a staff in a hired gown, a doorman, effectively. Port in the 17th century meant door rather than just carrying goods. We don't have a picture of his bier or his hearse, but I did find something in West Tanfield in Yorkshire. The bier is the stand for the coffin that carries the coffin or stands the coffin. The hearse in those days was the superstructure around the coffin, and that is what you can see. The claim is that it comes from a French word for a harrow, upside down. I am not sure about that. It doesn't seem very credible, but it will have been covered by cloth. So now we go on to the procession. So this is what they had to buy or hire. In this case, they had to buy it because it was personal to the family. The standard was 4.5 yards long. It was huge. It's a pointed flag, but it's a token of his knighthood. There were 6 pennants. There was a majesty escutcheon, which I'll show you in a minute. There were 2 achievements, diamond hatchments, 10 dozen escutcheons in taffeta, 44 dozen escutcheons in buckram, 22 shields in pasteboard, 3 dozen large pendants. Well, you can read it for yourselves. The achievements, we call them hatchments, would have been hung over the house door and then taken to the church and set up in the church. And chaperoons were small shields on the horses' heads. I think they were the base for the trophies of mortality, the black feather plumes of the black horses that led the hearse. We do have a picture of the coat of arms of William III. That is an L square, a majesty escutcheon, and it's the lion and the unicorn. The lion looks as though the unicorn's just told him a funny joke, but still, never mind. And the best picture I could find for hatchments is in Ruislip Church. So you can see why they left them behind, can't you? Anyway, we don't have an image of the funeral procession, but I have got the funeral procession of General Monk, who effectively mounted the coup to bring Charles II back to the throne. And here you can see on the horses' heads probably trophies of mortality. You can see pennants. You can see a standard at the beginning, 4.5 yard type standard. Escutcheons are the little, I don't think we've got any escutcheons in this one. We've got drummers, we've got trumpeters. So we've got a racket for this thing coming down the road. And this is one of 7 pictures, so it was not a little event. And you've also got the hearse with, on this occasion, probably a wax model of General Monk. We found a ticket, an invitation to a funeral ticket. It's rather good, isn't it? Mr. Dodd was paid for dispensing the tickets. We don't know who was paid for printing. It may well have been Mr. Dodd. And now this is not Mr. Dodd's printing, but it's a lovely memento mori, skeletons and crossbones and time symbols. Time is ticking by. So there we go. Jolly, jolly little thing to get through the post. Okay, so that's the ticket. And now the procession. We know they had 8 mourners riding before the hearse. We know they had 3 heralds. We know they had a standard bearer. We know they had 24 pages in mourning suits, velvet caps and truncheons. Now, these pages are most likely to have been hired as children from Christ's Hospital. Christ's Hospital made quite a lot of income, both in charges and in donations, from making their children available for serious funerals. The London Metropolitan Archive has a record of attendance from 1622 to 1754, giving the full details of each event and the fees charged. So 24 kids from Christ's Hospital being part of the procession. Plumes of feathers for the hearse and the horses, 17 coaches, a coach for the coffin, 8 bearers for the coffin, 3 dozen flambeaux, flaming torches, and 314 pounds of wax tapers. I cannot make sense of this. Gilbert White of Selborne calculated the weight of wax tapers, and on using his figures, I think they bought enough wax to make 24,000 rush tapers. Goodness knows if each taper lasted an hour, how many hours light did that buy? So it's an astonishing quantity of wax. And this is the processional route. And the right-hand side of this page, I put a little pink circle around Gunnersbury House. That's a slightly later map than the date of the funeral. But if Rachel follows the route up Gunnersbury Lane, left at Gunnersbury Lane, Pope's Lane as it's called today, and then gets to the crossroads and shoots up towards Frog Lane and the Ealing Workhouse, there you will see a little picture of St Mary's Church. So that was the procession. And the coaches, we know, were rattling to and fro between the church and the house, both to get everybody there and to get everybody back. St Mary's at this time was a medieval church. It had a nave, a chancel, a north chancel, and a chapel to St Anne, and a bell tower for 5 bells. But in the church, Mary had to invest very heavily in more material, caddies, broadcloth, nails and tacks and broad bays, because the church was in an appalling state. It had been plundered by Cromwell's troops. In 1675, which was before our event, the services had to be held elsewhere because it was so dangerous to be in. The steeple collapsed in 1729 and destroyed the church, and the replacement was built in 1740. They were obviously using this new concrete, but it didn't do them any good. Okay, so they invested heavily in making the church acceptable, and then in the next image will give you the hearse, the frame and the cloth that covered it, the pinked work used about the hearse, the workmanship, and then they had to cover the pulpit and the desk, and all that cost serious money. So it's a really huge operation to keep this. And bear in mind that the whole thing was done in the 8 days before the 6 days of lying in state. Now, this actually is the most exciting picture of them all, I'm afraid, because it shows you the number of people who were selling or making or lending cloth. It shows £177 on mourning rings, which we can't find any record of. But as you come down, you see a wine dealer called Mr. Worldly, which is wonderful. But the two that really matter are Mr. Howell, the herald painter, and Mr. Morris, the undertaker. Now, at the very bottom, there are the heralds at arms. Now, I'm not sure about these folk, but the serious money went to Mr. Howell and Mr. Morris. There was no other fee paid to the College of Arms. I am not sure that these were College of Arms heralds. It's possible that they were bogus heralds. Now, this turns into a story about the economics of funerals. The College of Arms had the monopoly of aristocratic funerals until 1675. So that's a little before Maynard died. After 1675, the profession or the business of undertaking emerged very rapidly. Undertakers had been supplying the College of Arms with what the college needed for their funerals. So they were already making coffins, hiring out cloth and all that sort of thing. They were doing a similar service. But undertakers were a lot cheaper and a lot faster than the college, which did a full-scale review of the entitlement to arms of the person who had died. Now, the importance of Mr. Howell was that he made his living painting bogus College of Arms arms. They'd caught him twice, producing completely inaccurate, unsuitable hatchments and escutcheons and paintings, and they'd taken him to court. So he was in dispute with the College of Arms. But it was obvious that he was an attractive employee because he charged a fair amount of money to Mary Maynard. And so we've got a curiosity. It's possible that Lady Mary was organising the funeral on the cheap. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than it would have been. But at the same time, a lot of this funeral was actually there to emphasize her status, her high status. And you do have to remember for this one that Lady Mary Maynard was only about 40 when she was burying her very elderly husband. Now we'll look at Mr. Morris's undertaker, 1688, Trade Directory in London, and there is Mr. Morris, the undertaker. The rest of this screen is about Thomas Salter, who took over Mr. Morris's business at the Four Coffins in Cheapside. But in 1693, James Morris was advertising mourning beds, black or grey, and that becomes significant. So what you've got is the shop sign of a dangling coffin and the trade card. And you can see that in the 1730s, Thomas was providing very much the same cloaks, scarves, velvets, feathers, wax tapers, flambeaux, tickets, and so on. It's difficult to translate money. It may have cost £166,000. It depends which one you use. Now, for 6 months, Lady Maynard slept in her mourning bed that she had hired from Mr. Morris, a fine cloth bed and counterpane, which she had hired from Mr. Morris, and at the time she was living in Warwick House in Holborn, which was Maynard's London City address. So there we have 6 months of funeral mourning on the mourning bed. The last picture for the main sequence is a picture of not a very good copy, and he doesn't look the jolliest of fellows, but it's a copy of the Blickling thing. Maynard was a lawyer. His will was so complex that it took 50 years of court cases and acts of parliament to resolve. The relatives were at 6s and 7s, and his will was stunningly complicated. He had donated law books to Harvard University. His massive collection of law papers is in the archives at Lincoln's Inn. And after 6 months of mourning, Lady Mary gave back the mourning bed to the undertaker and married the 5th Earl of Suffolk, Henry Howard, and she lived on until the 1720s, and she died aged 71. And there is a complex link between Lady Mary and another talk in the Luminaries series relating to Marble Hill. But it's so complicated, I'll have to wait until somebody wants me to tell them. The coda of this talk is an advertisement for our book. Val Bott and I wrote Gunnersbury Park, The Place and the People. It's only £6.95. It's absolutely fabulous. And if you want it cheaper, we'll engrave our names upon it. And we sell it through the Brentford and Chiswick Local History Society. And I'd also like to mention visitgunnersbury.org, because the book is also for sale at the museum itself. So there we are, Maynard's funeral and the future of his fourth wife. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, James, for that extraordinary talk, and all of that detail coming out of a teeny tiny little almanac, which was just, that would fit into the size of your hand or into a small pocket.
This is the edited version.
I just want to draw your attention to some of the other talk, well, all of the other talks in our series. And I think you are going to find connections. This is one of the reasons why we do themed talks. You'll find connections across the talks. And as James has mentioned, there are connections between the inhabitants of Gunnersbury Park and of Marble Hill House. So we're sort of about halfway through our list. Next week, we're really looking forward to Katie Hinchcliffe talking about Hogarth's House, and then Alexis Haslam on Fulham Palace, which will end the set of 6. And then we have a wonderful little add-on for us, a double act where Kew Palace and Strawberry Hill will present an amazing pair of papers on love, death and royalty.